Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Jacqueline Selman. I'm the manager of public programs at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We will formally begin in just a minute, but before we do, I wanted to run us through a few housekeeping items. So first, I'd like to mention that there is live captioning tonight. So if you do want to use that option, you just click the CC button, which is at the bottom of your screen. Also, we welcome any questions you have. There's a lot of content being covered tonight, so if you have questions throughout the program, just put them in the Q&A function also at the bottom of your screen, and we will collect them throughout the program and send them to our conversants toward the end of our hour together. We are so pleased to host this program tonight. It's Design Insights 2021 with Heather Dewey-Hagborg and Chelsea Manning as part of our ongoing Target Free Thursday night digital programming. I should mention that the museum is currently open with limited capacity, so if you're in town, we welcome you to visit us. We're still free on Thursday nights as usual. You just need to request a ticket in advance, so sign up online. It's super easy. I've done it several times. And the exhibition that this work references, or this conversation references tonight, is in an exhibition called Designs for Different Futures, which my colleague Emmett will chat a bit more about in a moment. It closes on April 11th. So if you're in town, we do encourage you to come on by and check out this incredible design exhibition. Just bring your mask and we hope to see you there. So thank you. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for doing all this digital content with us. We're so pleased to have this conversation happen. I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Emmett Byrne, the design director at the Walker Arts Center, to give us an introduction for tonight's program. So I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you, Jackie. As she said, I'm Emmett Byrne. I'm the design director and associate curator of design here at the Walker. Thanks everybody for coming out. I think this is going to be an amazing program. Just really quickly, I wanted to talk about the Insights Design Lecture Series. It's been going on for over 35 years now, and it's a collaboration between the Walker Arts Center and AIGA Minnesota. And I want to thank my colleagues at AIGA, especially Brent Stickles, for such an enduring partnership. They're such a great organization, and they work hard to celebrate great design here in the Twin Cities. So if you can check out their website, aigaminnesota.org, you can see what events that they've got coming up. Tonight's Insights is extra special because Heather is also featured in our current exhibition, Designs for Different Futures, as Jackie said. It's a show that looks at the ways that designers create, critique, and question possible futures, big and small. I am super excited to hear how tonight's speakers respond to that prompt and how they describe our capacities to affect multiple futures, or even if that's the right question to ask in the first place. So tonight's first speaker, Heather Dewey-Hagborg, is an information artist and biohacker who creates speculative projects that critique issues of technology, surveillance, and image culture. Heather's work has been discussed broadly in the international media, in publications such as the New York Times, Wired Magazine, and The Guardian. She is an artist in residence at the Exploratorium San Francisco and a visiting assistant professor of interactive media at NYU Abu Dhabi, and received a PhD in electronic arts from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She is the recipient of the New Technology Art Award and a Creative Capital Award, and her work is in the collections of several museums, including the Pompidou and the V&A, and has been displayed in numerous triennials, biennials, and even the World Economic Forum, where her work with Chelsea was first premiered. More than likely, you're familiar with our second speaker, Chelsea Manning, as an activist, technologist, and former intelligence analyst who in 2010 publicly disclosed a trove of US military and diplomatic documents exposing a range of governmental abuses related to the Afghan and Iraq wars. She has received a host of international awards that celebrate her courage and the global impact of her activism, including the US Peace Prize in 2013 and the EFF Pioneer Award in 2017. As a public speaker, Chelsea is now a highly visible leader in both the movements for transgender justice and government accountability. She lectures, writes, and tweets on everything from cryptocurrency to human rights to machine learning. And most recently, you can find her on Twitch, where you can watch her live streams of games such as Minecraft and City Skylines. So without further ado, I'm super excited for tonight's talk, and I'll hand it over to Heather.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you to Jacqueline and Emmett for inviting us. Thank you, Chelsea, so much for joining us here today, for joining me, and to all the technical and support staff that are making this event possible tonight. I'm going to introduce a little bit of the backstory behind how Chelsea and I came to know each other, and then we'll have some dialogue kind of intermingled with some discussions of art projects. So I first got to know Chelsea Manning by reading her DNA. Before we ever exchanged a letter or text message, she mailed me her cheek swabs and hair clippings, and I extracted her DNA, sequenced and analyzed it to create her portrait. Three years earlier, I had created a system for algorithmically generating 3D faces based on DNA data. I collected forensic samples strangers left behind on the streets of New York City, brought them to GenSpace, a new community biology lab in Brooklyn, extracted DNA and analyzed it to make a guess about what that person might look like based on genomic research and machine learning models. And I would generate a handful of different possible versions of that person's face, maybe 5 to 7 different versions, and then choose the one that made me feel something, that pulled me in some aesthetic direction, or maybe it reminded me of someone. And here you can see one sample. So you can see the cigarette butt that the portrait was generated from. You can see a picture of the location it was collected in Bushwick. And you can see the prediction of what that person's face might look like. So you can see that they're printed at human size in full color and have this kind of eerily lifelike quality. And this is the work that's on display at the Walker, as mentioned, Stranger Visions. And the piece was meant to forecast where this technology called DNA phenotyping was going. It was meant to call attention to new vulnerabilities of surveillance, and also to the impulse to genetic determinism, this kind of wish to be able to completely predict someone from nothing more than their genes. And it was meant to get people thinking about the liability of their physical bodies, that they're always shedding this most personal of information, and that it was increasingly legible, that new technology made it faster and cheaper, easier for anyone to come along and sequence their DNA. And I thought this forecast might become a reality in something like 5 years. But just 2 years later, a company launched a service claiming to create portraits of suspects from nothing more than crime scene evidence. And this is an actual clipping from a newspaper of this DNA mugshot that a friend sent me. And this was just too soon. I knew the science wasn't nearly ready, if it could ever be ready. And after all, I'd just been generating handfuls of different possible faces based on DNA, choosing ones I found artistically appealing. What would the police's criteria be? So I realized I had to address the reductionism in this process with my work going forward. But at the moment, I wasn't sure how. And then in July of 2015, I received this email from Paper Magazine, totally out of the blue, asking if I would be interested in making a portrait of Chelsea Manning from her DNA. And Chelsea had been incarcerated since her public gender transition. And at this time, no one was allowed to visit her or photograph her. And so DNA was this way of sneaking her identity out of prison, of breaking this censorship. And I was so excited both to pay this tribute to Chelsea Manning, who I greatly admired, but also to use the portrait as an opportunity to address this reductionism inherent in DNA phenotyping. Chelsea, Paper Magazine had already spoken with you. Can you tell us a bit about what was happening on your end at this time?
Yeah, actually, whenever we were talking about this, I was like, "Wow, it's been 6 years since this happened. It feels like it was a century ago." But yeah, I remember I had been in prison at Fort Leavenworth for 2 years after sentencing, so I was pretty much in my rhythm and like my prison rhythm. And at some point, I got a letter from Mr. Rickman, who sent me this like vague request of like, of like, well, you know, because like I think that they wanted to send a photographer into the prison somehow, and I was like, that's never gonna happen. Like, you know, like it was never gonna happen. So then someone, I don't recall who, made the suggestion, and I was just like, yes. Like as soon as like it was like as soon as like you know, like this might be a weird thing to ask, but you know, could we somehow get your DNA? And I was like, yeah, I think that, yeah, it seems like something we could do. And I responded back, and I got ended up giving you, I think, hair clippings and some other thing. Was it fingernails?
Here they are.
Oh, cheek swabs. That's what it was.
Yeah.
So cheek swabs and hair clippings. So I was able to put that in. I was able to put that into a tiny paper bag with my little address there. That's my prison address at the time. And I went up to the mail window, and they asked me, or I was just like, hey, you know, like, dude, can I put these cotton swabs into a little bag? And they're like, okay, that's weird. Okay, whatever. Who cares? So the mail window didn't stop it or anything like that. So and that's how we got it out. Very simple.
And on my end, then I received this envelope in the mail with Chelsea's hair clippings and cheek swabs. And I walked through then the same process that I had walked through with Stranger Visions, extracting the DNA, analyzing the traits, generating these models. Except this time, I generated two different versions of you to be shown side by side. One that is algorithmically neutral and one that is parameterized female.
Yeah.
And so we talked about these different possibilities as we started the process. So this idea to present maybe one or the other face. And we agreed that this was the best approach to combat this kind of reductionism around genetic identity and gender, and show this absurdity of thinking that you could have a machine learning model that represents a typical female face, for example.
Right.
Can you remember when I sent you these prints, these two faces in prison, what you thought?
Yeah, so I got these.
You imagined?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, you know, the first thing that came to mind was, wow, these look like Half-Life 2 models, like face models from like a video game in the like mid 2000s. I think that was my very, very first thought. But then the second thought was, you know, like, and I got them. So I got two versions. I got glossy versions, which I couldn't keep because they were glossy. And then I got paper versions, which I was able to keep. But I was able to see the glossy versions. And the glossy version, I looked at the mail window and basically like examined it, and I was just like, that's really interesting. That like, because it didn't really occur to me that there would be any kind of phenotyping based on chromosome, based on like chromosome types, like that like I didn't even think about that, you know. So it's like fascinating to see like how that played out, because you know, is something as arbitrary as that, you know, like like how genetic is gender, how genetic is, you know, sex or whatever. That was like an immediate like red flag to me. I was like, well, this is a rabbit hole to go down, especially as a trans person.
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen now so much public critique around these kinds of reductionisms and biases in machine learning. This has become much more discussed. At this point, this was still something that people weren't talking about widely, that you would have these types of stereotypes embedded within machine learning.
Right. Indeed. I think one of the other things that I found fascinating about these pictures was I think it was just like it had never occurred to me like how closely they would actually resemble me and close members of my family. You know, like I was struck by the fact that they just look like me. They're pretty close. Like, you know, it's almost like I'm getting like facial feminization surgery or something like that. Like I'm looking at three models of like different types of surgery. You know, like all the faces distinctly look, you know, based on me. Like that I find that very striking personally.
So this is a quote from the article that came out in Paper Magazine that these two images accompanied. And so Chelsea says, I don't consider myself a radical. Is it radical to seek justice? Is it radical to be rescued by love? Is it subversive to be sweet? Instead of trying to be radical, I just try to be true to myself. Is it radical to be true to yourself? And I found this really compelling and thought-provoking. And so it inspired the name of the original piece that we worked on, Radical Love. So Chelsea,
Yeah.
6 years have passed. How do you feel about these ideas of being
Woo!
radical?
Those have been some wild 6 years. So it's interesting. I find it interesting because you know, it turns out that these things are apparently radical for everyone. And you know, and certainly through the last 4 years of my life, because I was released from prison 2 years later, and it's still been a wild ride, you know, for not just me, but for, you know, everyone else, you know, for everyone else in the last years. So, you know, I'm struck by how optimistic the tone is, particularly with how sort of like more of a tendency towards seriousness or darkness. You know, it's almost poetic. And I would struggle to write those words independently in this moment in particular, but, you know, I'm still struck by them, you know, and I'm surprised. I almost should feel surprised to have this sort of dug up, like it's like a time capsule where it's like 6 years ago, like this is what I was thinking, before, you know, before sort of the rise of fascism, the rise of the police state, the rise of, you know, the pandemic and whatnot. So.
Yeah, your communications from prison, I mean, the letters that we shared and these communications were often so incredibly optimistic. I mean,
Yeah.
You really lifted me, and I know many other people, up with that sharing. I mean, this incredible generosity. So these are the final 3D printed portraits. And in January of 2016, they premiered at the World Economic Forum. And Chelsea, what did it mean to you at that moment, to have this kind of representation at a particular event like this kind of congregation of world leaders?
I have this theory about space that I've learned in prison. Like, this is a very personal, it's a very unscientific theory that I have, which is that space is like, because one of the things that you learn is that whenever you don't have stuff, space becomes important. Sort of the territoriality, like how big your bubble is, who can traverse in different spaces, who has access to different spaces, who's let in, who's let out. You know, corrections officers can go down this hallway, but, you know, an inmate can't. You know, an inmate that's higher up on the, you know, sort of the like prison social hierarchy can go and sit in this chair, whereas like somebody who's just arrived and you know, is still, you know, sort of getting into the prison population is, you know, like that's just society at large, is like the control of spaces and the sort of like this being an extremely exclusive space, and yet I have some kind of like proxy presence, some kind of some kind of avatar, if you will, you know, and, you know, while it's artistic, it's still, you know, based upon, you know, almost like an extension of myself. So I find it fascinating because, like, this is such an exclusive place, you know, the rigors of security, the fact that it's like, so, you know, like it's physically remote, you know, where it is in Europe, you know, so to have this sort of like, and then the layers of security, because you have all these like heads of state, you know, from all across the world, coming in and exploring this very exclusive space. So it's, you know, just the sort of space quality is what I find so fascinating about it. Like being able to project myself into the space and ask the questions as to like how why does this space exist, and how is it that this particular thing can get in there, and things like that. So
Yeah, I totally agree. It felt to me also like this wonderful intervention that you're, like this, like haunting them from prison.
Yeah, it's hard to forget about me.
So the story doesn't end there. There's another couple chapters to go. So in November of 2016, with Obama's exit from the White House looming, I wanted to work on something to assist with Chelsea's campaign for Obama to commute her sentence. And so Chelsea and I teamed up with the illustrator Shirley Kanungo, and we developed a comic book. And you can view the whole thing at suppressedimages.net. It's all online for free. And so the comic goes over the whole story that I've been sharing with you here today in an abbreviated form, and it's narrated as a dialogue between Chelsea and I, drawing on our letters and communications, and narrates our process of working together, our process of creating these portraits. But it ends with a speculative twist where Obama commutes Chelsea's sentence and she's freed and comes to the gallery to see an exhibition of her physical portraits in person for the first time.
Yep.
And we published this on the morning of January 17th. And that very day, Obama commuted her sentence.
Yeah, a few hours after you released this, I believe it came out 9 a.m. and it was announced at 2 p.m.
What was this day like for you, Chelsea?
Oh God. I was just working in the wood shop. That was just another day for me. Like I wasn't even thinking about this, and I finally forgot about it. And then all of a sudden, like the head of security for the prison, comes by, just storming through with like 2 other guards, and just like you got to come with us, like you're, so then I went through the process. They put me into a separate area for pending release, prisoners, which was just a total shock. Like it was just complete change of tone overnight. I had no way of processing that moment whatsoever. I was just like, what? Like I didn't even get the chance to like gather the things that I had like in the wood shop, because we hadn't cleaned up. So like literally like the tools and the stuff that I was working on were all just sitting there when they grabbed me. And I was still covered in wood. I was still covered in wood chip dust by the time I by the time I was put into the release ward.
Yeah, it all seems inevitable in retrospect, but at the time, I mean, there was such a hardworking campaign working for your release, but so many people would say it can never happen.
Yeah,
Obama will never do that.
Yeah,
and so I mean, it took really this incredible optimism for us to envision that this would really happen, kind of in opposition to all of this negativity.
Yeah, certainly.
And this was
Hey!
the first message when you stepped out.
I remember that tweet.
That was really wonderful to see. So once you were freed, we knew we had to make this forecast from the comic book exhibition a reality. And so the Friedman Gallery in New York offered us a show that summer. And suddenly we had this 1,000 square foot space and an opportunity to really push the idea further. Actually, a necessity to push the idea further, because 2 portraits wouldn't work very well in such a big space. And so we came up with this idea to scale the whole thing up and present these 30 different versions of what you might look like based on your DNA. And to use that as a way of showing the subjectivity of interpretation of DNA, but also the subjectivity of all data. And we worked on this while you were still in prison, because it took 5 months for you to be released after having your sentence commuted. And so we were working in this kind of very slow, tedious way through the mail, through design, also, so it's slowly unfolding project. But we managed to have this unrelenting optimism that you shared with us from prison. And in particular, on your insistence on unity across identity categories and this kind of encouragement to come together. This really spoke to me. And so the form of the artwork invokes this idea of molecular solidarity, and the form of it references this idea of a crowd that's standing with you, fighting for your release from prison. And so in the quote here from the interview with Paper Magazine, you talk about this coalition that is forming, this coalition of humanity. And you describe the work we did together as almost postmodern.
Oh yeah, I remember.
So I wonder if you want to speak to that, this idea of postmodernism and kind of how that aligns with the coalition of humanity, like moving beyond splintering identities and forming this kind of coalition.
Well, I'll start with what I mean by postmodern, right? And there's been obviously there's obviously been some discussion about like what does postmodern mean, and particularly in art. I usually view like modern as being the sort of like industrial, clean, sleek like approach to a more universal sort of art. Like if you think architecture, like you're thinking large glass skyscrapers that could fit at any major city, right? There's sort of like a universal aspect to modernity. And then like the postmodern sort of like a deconstruction of that, a sort of like a meta-analysis of modern art, like like why is it that Western, why is it that that Europe and the United States have such a significant influence over what is considered modern, over the modern interpretation? Why is this happening? And I view sort of like I sort of view the postmodern as sort of like the dissolving of that sort of like meta-analysis into something that is a lot more that art is no longer about deconstructing, is no longer about deconstructing things. And whenever you're speaking of the postmodern, I view like that contemporary art it seems to, in my opinion, coexist with technology as opposed to like try to either embrace it or deconstruct it. Like they're so close, they're just closely bound together. And I think of like deep fakes and like other machine learning produced artwork that that exists now, like in the other things that I do. I mean, I talk about this a lot in my Twitch stream, so that's why, one of the reasons why I'm talking about deep fakes in particular here. Whenever it comes to like this coalition of humanity, like I like it's harder to say that part because like this was in 2015. This when I was a little bit more optimistic about sort of like the way things were going and things like that. Now it feels to me like the social media and the sort of getting sucked down the rabbit hole of social media has really sort of threatened this idea with everybody sort of being in different bubbles of humanity and different sections of society. And I do think we will overcome this, but I don't this is becoming the more of the sort of the fact that somebody can go down the rabbit hole of being a Q believer now, and another person can become an anti-vaxxer. Those are very those are very good indications to me that that there's sort of like we're a little bit further from that than I was hopeful of that back then. But I still think that we can have a more positive thing, and I don't know how to relate that to contemporary art for the moment.
I think it does though, because I think it's this postmodern, and we can invoke that in art perhaps sooner than we can in society at large. It provides maybe an inspiration or a model to look towards that isn't there yet.
Well, I mean, and I guess you can connect that to like memes. Like memes are a form of artwork, in my opinion. They're crude and they're simple, but the amount of creativity, and especially because they have to be good memes in order to spread. So that is, in my opinion, a postmodern form of art. Is memes or emote or emotes or a GIF. or a TikTok, like the again, it's the technology allows the artwork to exist, but it is not like the technology is not it's not a critique of the technology. It's not a explicit invocation of of the fact that the technology exists. It just coexists with the with bleeding edge technology. Hey,
So here you are.
my hair was short.
On August 5th. Yeah. Our forecast came true. And so here's Chelsea standing in the gallery, meeting her 30 variations. What did you think when you walked in and saw these 30 interpretations of your DNA?
What I think, I thought it was, I never thought I would be sitting there. So it was definitely fascinating to be there. I was also surprised at how large the space was, like the amount of space that this exhibit took up in the gallery was. I was like, wow, it's not just it is a centerpiece. It is not just another piece of a larger exhibit. So the sort of centering of my DNA and interpretations of my DNA generated algorithmically was fascinating.
Yeah, it would really draw people off the street. I mean, what you can't see in the picture is that there were these huge glass storefront windows opening onto a street in Soho, and people would walk by and just jaw drop and drift in. And one of the really nice things that happened with this installation also is that people got really into it physically. Like people would drift in between the faces. They'd kind of try different ones on and take selfies with the different faces that they may be related to. And, it really became this kind of coalition of humanity through Chelsea's DNA, kind of everyone connecting to her, and sort of themselves also.
Yeah.
It was really beautiful. I was so happy that you were able to be there.
Yeah, it's all it is just my biochemistry. It started all this.
So maybe on a little bit more serious note. So we've talked a bit about Foucault and ideas of biopower. And so generally this idea that the state has power over populations, this power to make live or let die, and that there's an increasing enmeshment of politics with biological life. And I see my own work as trying to complicate this by pushing back against forms of biological surveillance, against reductionism. And Chelsea, for you, this must be such an intensely personal relationship, having been over so many years in situations of extreme governmental control and monitoring and suppression. What does biopower and biopolitics mean for you?
So biopower is sort of, there's obviously, there's either the control aspect or the autonomy aspect. So, it's really difficult, particularly like in a moment where we just are hopefully winding down from the worst of the of a world altering, history altering global pandemic. Because there's when I'm often talking about this stuff, and I bring this up, I'm front loading this because it often becomes one of the questions that's brought up is sort of like, okay, so you advocate for bodily autonomy, but how does that relate to public health? And there's sort of the clashing of the two interests. One would say, well, of course the government would. Of course, the government or institutions of society should do these things, in order to, in order to control your body for public health reasons, which makes sense. It protects people, etc. And then on the other hand, with the bodily autonomy part, and the contradiction, like, that comes with like, oh, like we have bodily freedom, we have bodily autonomy. I should be able to make decisions about the choice about what I do with my body, what I do with my reproductive system, what life choices I have, in terms of like, as a trans person, I take hormones. As a trans person, I've gotten surgery. As a as a sort of 30-year-old young person, I am applying to get I've been smashing that button, trying to refresh the page in the New York Health website to try to get vaccine, things like that. And it's just it's become so centered in this moment where so many aspects of different things, whether it's abortion, or if it's trans kids getting hormone blockers and be able to participate in sports, or whether or not you should wear a mask when you go to the store, and whether or not you should be able to stop people from coming into the store if they're not wearing a mask. Like, these have all become hot, heated, intense things. So like biopower is almost the center of the of the modern debate. Like, Foucault is even more relevant now than any of his work than his works have been at any time. And I was just I think I've talked to you before. I was helping a friend do a podcast specifically on biopower and Foucault. And in the context of the pandemic.
Yeah, you point to this kind of tension between, as you say, between this idea of having kind of public health versus bodily autonomy. How do we find our way through that?
Well, I mean, I think that the analysis that the Foucault analysis would be that like wearing a mask, for instance, you would be violating the bodily autonomy of somebody who doesn't wish to get sick, right? So you are essentially asserting your biopower. You're essentially turning a potentially sick person is essentially asserting their power over somebody who does not wish to be. So it is rather than being about bodily autonomy, it is simply about the abuse of biopower, of an individual's biopower over another. Same thing with with whether or not a parent can, in my opinion, tell a teenage child like whether or not they should take hormone blockers based upon simply the whim of a parent, as opposed to like the bodily autonomy of a teenager who obviously is trans and should be discussing this with a doctor, a therapist, etc. Gatekeeping is obviously another is sort of like another biopower aspect, and things like that. So that's where it's you have to actually go through the analysis. You can't just like have like the circle, the square, and the triangle of the different like shapes, and like have simple like things where you can just sort of like sift through different medical biological transhuman issues. Like you have to go through the sort of like analysis of how what are the relationships, who has power over who's asserting power for who, what are the what are the interests of the different parties involved in this segment of society. So it's a lot more complicated than just like it's George Orwell 1987. It's like I'm wearing them. I like tell me not to wear a mask. This is violation. Like it's a lot more complicated than that. In that instance, it's just somebody who wants to assert dominance over other people who are more vulnerable and potentially immunocompromised or old.
Yeah, I agree. It's always about this analysis of power relations. Thanks for that. So the current exhibition at the Walker, as has been described, addresses this idea of designs for different futures. So using art and design to think through what lies ahead and perhaps how to frame a different possible. And Chelsea, we've been discussing the idea of the speculative, and my work is sometimes described as a form of speculative design, for the better or the worse. And there's definitely some kind of future thinking involved in my work, without question. But it is also really grounded in the present. So it's grounded in doing actual laboratory work in sciences and technologies that are being developed now. and in thinking about the social inequities that they will worsen. And so it's making these ideas that can seem kind of abstract palpable as a way of preparing ourselves for the threats lying ahead. Chelsea, what do you think is the main danger facing us today?
I mean, it depends on where you are and who you are. And that's, I think, the sort of like the everything that we've seen in the last, year or so has really shaken things up, and it's like it's accelerated sort of how I was warning things would sort of play out. Whenever we started working on this project together in 2015, I was writing for The Guardian, and I was talking about a lot of these issues, the sort of kernels of that are now the primary drivers of the global conversation, or the global the sort of like global discussion. And I live in the United States. I am an activist. I have been out to protests. I have been out in the streets before in the last year. I am a trans person. The biggest threat to me is unfortunately is unfortunately the NYPD. So in my daily interactions, like that is a genuine threat. If you're a person of color and you're down south, it is it could be any white person, it could be any person in a MAGA hat, whether or not, or whatever hat they wear, in the next 2 or 3 years, right? Whatever symbols they decide to adopt. If you're an undocumented person, the biggest threats you're facing are immigration, and also the vast surveillance network that people are just like, the expectation that everybody has on Facebook, the expectation that everybody should have a credit card, the expectation, and that this goes for homeless people too, like the expectation that you're going to have this pile of digital of a digital footprint everywhere you go. I mean, the threats all come from, and this goes back to like intersectionality, as like the threats are all coming from sort of the same pot of different things, but it's different. It hits people in different ways and in different times and in different places. So, like that's how I feel. I think that I think that the political and economic system that we have come to depend on, that cataclysmically failed to provide for people in the United States and in parts of Europe, is essentially the lead progenitor, the lead cause of these things. It is the driver. It is the driver of the rise of populist fascism. It is the driver of the fact that the supply chains couldn't, imploded, and the stock market shot up anyway. Like it's just. I think that we're in an unsustainable system, and the fact that the system is going to have to come to a reckoning at some point is, I think, the biggest threat that everyone faces, but everyone's going to face that in different ways and at different times. That's a long-winded answer.
No, I really appreciate the answer. Thank you. And maybe we can end on a slight note of hope. So I'll share one last work that came more recently. So 2 years ago, in the wake of Trump and Brexit, I had this idea of creating a virus that would infect people with love, a literal love virus. And I worked with a company in Philadelphia that makes custom viruses all the time. Integral Molecular is their name. And we produced an actual retrovirus that was capable of infecting human cells and inserting an extra copy of the oxytocin gene. So this is a gene that's associated with love and affection, devotion, cuddliness. And I dreamt up this kind of future world where people drop out of their digital devices and come together physically. Well, that was before COVID. And now perhaps this feels both more distant and more relevant than ever before. And so while the log virus is real, I think of the piece mainly as a device for engaging utopia, for imagining different possible futures that isn't about borders and isn't about distance, but is about a kind of messy closeness. So Chelsea, we've talked about how it feels sometimes like this whole concept of the future is over. Where do you think we can find hope? How do we keep going?
I'm an activist. I've been working all week, doing, like helping people move stuff like out of their apartments because they can't afford rent anymore, for free. I have just been moving boxes and painting stuff and just moving stuff around. The concept of mutual aid comes to mind. This idea of like people pitching in, helping each other. I don't think it's right that that we have to do GoFundMe's for people to get healthcare, especially the trans, particularly for what I see in my daily interactions, like in the trans community. Where I see hope is the fact that like in the middle of the sort of disaster and the cataclysm, preppers would describe this as an SHTF light, a shit hits the fan light version, right? Which is like, it's not the zombie apocalypse, but like a significant alteration to human life and society as we know it, at least potentially temporarily, but perhaps never quite going back to the way things were. Seeing the fact that people were able to band together, they were able to advocate for each other and defend each other, protect each other, and and I think that we as consumers and like as just people who have been like living in the US in particular, I'm speaking very specifically to the US, right? We're a consumer-based economy, right? For a moment, we just weren't able to. For a moment, we just got out of that bubble of consumption, where there was a moment there like where people where the NFL wasn't as in your face and everywhere, right? Like sure there was a Super Bowl, but it wasn't quite the same, right? The basketball games aren't quite the same. Reality TV shows aren't quite the same. They're not hitting people the same way. Like there's sort of more of this like general sort of like wake up moment, and that's that slid people in some instances more and more towards like social media, being sort of like put into a deeper bubble. But I think it's also like woken some other people when as soon as they burn out of that too, they're sort of like, wait a second, where have I been? And I think that's like the biggest optimism I have is like people realizing as their material conditions deteriorate, that they can that even though that they don't have a lot, if they band together with other people who also don't have a lot, then they together collectively we actually do have a lot. We have it's a situation where the sum is greater, where the sum of the whole is greater than its parts. I think I said that right.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe we look at some of the questions from the audience. I'll just stop sharing.
Okay.
Anything jumping out that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I think, I'll start with the first question for me. What are the implications of large-scale COVID-19 on... Oh, you don't want me to answer that question?
It just
it
just jumped to the answer.
It's under answer. Okay. What are the implications of large-scale COVID-19 testing on biosecurity? What about commercial sector DNA collectors like 23andMe? Those are two different questions, thankfully. COVID-19 testing on biosecurity. COVID-19 testing, they ask a lot of information on forums. They don't seem to have the capacity. I have not seen them seem to have the capacity to manage all of that, to use it for surveillance purposes so far. Maybe down the line, maybe down the line there is some risk, and I certainly saw that there were a lot of people who, whenever they were given a questionnaire, they're like, and think of this along the lines of like undocumented people or sex workers, where you're being asked a number of different questions as you're going through a form to like get a test, right, or to get the vaccine in more recent time, right? So these sort of like invasive questions, they haven't seemed to be collecting that information because of just how much the sheer volume of it, and even the state just kind of like does, like they're just mostly just using it to like screen people. But in the commercial sector, very different story. Commercial sector DNA collectors like 23andMe, there is a great radio series. I think Radiolab recently did a podcast series on this, on how awful and how unprotected these things are. You basically, when you give your DNA sequence, it becomes almost an open book, right? Anybody can use it for any different reason. And this idea of like what is it? Familial
Familial search.
Yeah, familial search has completely thrown the entire criminal justice system into absolute it's just been wild. Like you've seen like protesters that leave cigarette butts, like where they try to find a cigarette, where like like some green activists like found a cigarette butt like in the middle, and this relates a lot to Dr. Dewey Hagberg's work, is like is this idea of like, like they took the cigarette butt and they did the analysis, and they looked at like ancestry.com data, right, and 23andMe data, and they bought it. Like the cops just bought it, and they're just like, they just ran it, and they're just like, oh, we found some family members. Oh, that's the lead that like leads us to like the rest of our investigation in terms of like finding and arresting a protester at like a pipeline, protest, right? Based upon like just a little bit of waste that happened to be in a particular spot. So
Yeah.
and because like everybody says like, oh, this is for murder, and I start with that case because like everybody's like, oh, we'll be able to solve cold murder cases, right? Well, that's not where they're starting to use this stuff. They're using this stuff immediately. It's like green, it's like on green, on like sort of like green green environmental activists, right? Like and protests, right? It just shows sort of the sort of like the laser focusedness of the police. What's another question?
I would just jump in also. I mean, I just want to mention, so the same company that sold this product of DNA phenotyping that I shared in the presentation, they are also, of course, offering a product to do the familial search, this genetic genealogy, exploiting these open databases where people have been sharing their DNA to find their roots, to find their families if they were adopted. And this company comes in and offers the police this service to totally exploit that. I find it really horrifying that this is going on and that it is legal. And I just would also add that I think the risks with the COVID testing, so I agree that at the moment it might not be the main danger facing us today. I think it's the articulation, but I do worry about the function creep. So I do worry that, having this mass of our biological fluids that is being collected, that we have this mass of data that's sitting there. I mean, there's nothing to prevent, if you're looking at COVID DNA, there's nothing to prevent looking at anything else from DNA in the samples as well. So I do worry a bit about how that will progress over time, and thinking of differential access to spaces based on COVID testing. I mean, I encounter that all the time because I work at a university. In order to enter the university, I have to have a negative COVID test. So you just can't help thinking of what other kinds of bio access might enter into the picture that might be, really violating this kind of bodily autonomy like we were discussing earlier.
Yeah. Heather and Chelsea, what parallels do you observe between biological data information and network data information? That's what's so fascinating, is that any biological data or information immediately gets put into the data and the network information, especially when it comes to like machine learning. So it's fascinating to see. It's fascinating to see like there being like this like idea of like there being like a wall or some kind of discrete of some kind of like discrete difference between the two. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's so interesting to see like biological social networks that form. Like, for example, I have had my data, my DNA analyzed by 23andMe and other services. I always test things on myself. And, you know, there I have suddenly 7,000 new genetic relatives, which is this kind of strange biological social network that I
Right.
think really deserves further attention and thought. I haven't seen much work put into thinking through what that means.
I want to just go back a little bit and just say like, and just mention that I had to give my DNA to the United States government in order to get a security clearance in I think like 2007, right? So and again, you know, like going through my court martial process, right? So you know, like I'm in the FBI's CODIS database. What I think is fascinating is that the indicators are ancient technology, right? The ones that they actually, the things that they actually measure are so ancient and so old, right? That they're not the kinds of things in 23andMe, which I think, which is what I think is fascinating, is like the fact that like the number of what is it, like 100,000 different things that 23andMe, whereas I think it's like less than 100 for like the FBI code.
Oh yeah, it's like 21.
Yeah, so you know, and they picked ones that you know that are the least variable, you know, in terms of like, but you know, or sorry, that have the most variation among the population. But you know, it's still fascinating that that when you give your information for free, or to pay a company,
you pay for it, yeah.
You essentially pay for data to be in an open book, and you're essentially giving them more rights than the FBI does in a security clearance investigation or a criminal
absolutely
case.
Yeah,
it's just fascinating.
exactly. The CODIS profile is supposed to have nothing that relates, it's supposed to be totally non-coding, so it's supposed to, I mean, legally protect you from any kind of violation of finding out you know, anything about your phenotype, basically.
Yeah.
And whether or not that will prove to be the case as biology advances is interesting to watch. If we discover that these, you know, non-coding areas really pertain, you know, have more pertinent information than we thought.
Cool. What was the question again? I'm just pulling it up. Observe between biological data information, data network information. Okay. Another thing that I actually want to ask is like, what do you like? What do you think of facial recognition or gait recognition, like the walking? Like, you know, like would you consider those biological data? Because I certainly do.
Yeah, I think it's a continuum, definitely. I mean, I can just say that for me, my interest in working with DNA and thinking about genetic surveillance came from a long-term interest in looking at things that came before. I mean, looking at facial recognition, looking at cameras on the streets. You know, this was a big issue 10 years ago and before that. And the Patriot Act with warrantless wiretapping, analyzing voice, you know, these were forms of surveillance that I was very concerned about. And through thinking about those, you know, that led me to having this realization that there was this other form of genetic surveillance that was increasingly possible that wasn't being talked about. And actually, I would say it still isn't very much. I mean, it's a little bit more now than in 2012, but it, I think, really demands more attention than it's been given.
Cool. I'm going to answer this question. Where'd it go? I clicked a button and it went away.
Is this the, how did you feel coming face to face?
Yeah.
So how did you feel coming face to face with possibilities of what you could look like? As someone else who is under the trans umbrella, I'm curious how you felt viewing all these different possibilities.
Oh yeah, I see it now. Yeah, so you know, I found it fascinating because one of the things that, because essentially you kind of were my 23andMe, because you didn't give my data to anybody. You kept it, and you ended up destroying it, but I still got the analysis, right? I still got the readout. And what I found fascinating was how Danish I am, right? And how I have all of these different locators that are seaworthy, right? Like I have connections to the middle, like in my genetic history, I have strong probabilities for the Middle East, for parts of North Africa, for the entire sort of gambit, all the way from like the Baltic region and the Jutland Peninsula, which is the strongest indicator of my genetic of sort of like my geographic genetic profile, all the way down the coasts, being the strong, where I'm actually being fairly strong, but not being nearly as strong as the Danish aspect. And my ancestry, going back, I think 15 or 20 generations in Ireland, right? Both sides of the family, weirdly enough, there's actually a crossover where my family tree from my father and my mother, they branch off and they come back together at some point. That's how wild apparently Irish people are, in terms of like and how small it is. But then I had no idea that I would have so many genetic connections to people in the Middle East and North Africa. But then I realized, oh, sailors moving stuff, right? I have I'm from my family's from a port city in Ireland, so that makes sense. Like, and I had this discussion with you whenever this happened. I was like, wow, like I'm like my genetic profile is heavily influenced by sailing and like just sleeping around apparently.
Yeah, I remember we were chatting about this. I was sitting on an Amtrak train at the time. I can recollect that.
Yeah. So that's what I found fascinating. That's what I found fascinating was like this idea of like, there are parts of my history that I would never have been able to know, even though my family has a family tree and we have a family history and we have the formal thing, but like there was so much more richness than the documentary history. And you can see that, and you can see those possibilities in the actual exhibit, because you can see those different parts of my DNA that are in there that are just like recessed.
Just wondering if we take one last question before we wrap up. I don't know if there's one that you particularly like to look at.
Sure. I always love to talk about cryptocurrency. A little bit of sarcasm here. So new layers of security and currency in systems like Bitcoin and NFT. I'm not sure what they mean by that. NFT is not separate from like Ethereum or anything like that. But anyway, seem to be increasingly divorced from the physical and the biological. How do we think about emerging technologies that are so disconnected from the body? They are connected, and here's why. So cryptocurrency. Basic laws of thermodynamics. You take in a large information possibility space and you try to create entropy, right? You act as Maxwell's demon, right? And you try to take the egg and you try to sort it back to, like you break an egg, but it takes a lot of energy to sort it back together. That is essentially what cryptocurrency mining is. So it connects to us and to the environment, because the earth is the sun is bringing us energy, but the cryptocurrency doesn't exist in a closed system. It existed in the state of the entire world. So all of this energy that's being used, and it is a part of the sort of ecosystem, the energy usage, oxygen levels in like rainforests, like there's some aspect, some little bit of CO2 levels that is being exhausted through fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, in order to cheap natural gas usually straight from the source for some cryptocurrency mining operations. In order to mine cryptocurrency. So there isn't a disconnection. Like cryptocurrency is not disconnected from the physical space. It is literally sucking energy out of the physical space in order to give you a verifiable result. So it's fascinating stuff for sure, but it is cryptocurrency mining is not the act of that does not divorce it from reality. But once it's taken out, unless you lose your wallet, then yes, it is a resource, and it is a mathematical possibility, or it is a mathematical fingerprint of a hash, that can be transferred over elsewhere. So it becomes a part of the economy, but it's not coming from nowhere. It is similar in gold in that respect. So sorry to get off on a tangent.
No, that's good. That's good. And maybe I'll just answer the one last one, and then we'll call it a night. So from Alexa, what are some positive examples you can think of for use of this technology? So obviously the situation with Chelsea, I think that was an amazing way of showing how technologies can have these complexities. So on the one hand, can be these really oppressive forces.
Yeah, it was a way of Paper Magazine able to fill in the void of not being able to have a photograph in their magazine.
And fighting this censorship of your face, so this oppressive tool becomes reconfigured into a tool for liberation. Absolutely. And so I think, thinking of Chelsea's comment about the NYPD, I think that's one of the main things is like, keep it out of those hands. When these tools are used for investigating suspects by the police, I mean, it's just not an okay use of the technology right now. That is a force of oppression. It's going to be a force of racial profiling.
It already is.
It already is. And so I think the places where it has potential are cases like with Chelsea, and there have also been interesting scientific research around unidentified remains and kind of giving faces to victims of atrocities and disasters. And so I think there is a potential there to do a kind of nuanced and scientifically rigorous approach to phenotyping to give people back their faces, basically, when they've been denied them.
Right.
So maybe that's a nice note to end on.
Yeah, and I apologize for the audio issue. I don't know what it is, but I've been resetting my I'm literally building a studio in the middle of all this and moving boxes for other people and things like that. So,
something always happens with Zoom.
Yeah, it always happens with Zoom. So but luckily I have what, 3 microphones, so and 3 cameras, so
all right, fantastic. Thank you, Chelsea. It was wonderful to see you and to chat. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.